On the squatter stuff, did you have somebody squatting at one of your properties?
So I've had a handful of like, just we'll call them like non-professional squatters, like drug addicts that fell asleep in one of my construction projects, or a flip house that came and there was like a guy inside who was just on drugs and confused. And I say, all right, man, you got to go. And so, but a handful of people that I know have had serious squatter situations where like professionals have moved in that knew the laws, knew what they were doing, and really just exploited it. And I heard these stories and I was like, this is insane. And so that's when I made the I Stole a House video, and it completely exploded. And then I became like the lightning rod for every squatter story and scam story in the entire country. And it made me realize, yo, this is a very, it's a heinous crime that's not being addressed. It's an underserved market, and I think there's an opportunity here. And
Yeah.
so now I'm on a mission to educate people about it.
So what's the challenge with the city or county or state policy? Like, if you're the politician, what are they missing? Why are they allowing people to squat?
It comes down to landlord tenant law. Essentially, is what the squatters are doing is they're impersonating and getting the rights of a tenant. The tenant has a bundle of rights afforded to them just by, having a contract to rent a place. So what the squatter does is basically makes it seem as if they are a tenant, a legitimate tenant. They're not, but when the police officer arrives and the squatter says like, well, I've got this, lease here, it's fake, and the homeowner says like, that's not real, then we got a he said, she said situation. The cop says, you guys have got to go sort this out. And so then you're effed. You got a squatter.
Right. So then what do you do in that scenario?
Well, that's why I made. That's why I
So
made
if you're
this.
if you're an owner and that happens, what do you have to do currently? And then what's the actual fix long term?
So that's why I made Squatter Defender, because when I heard about all these different squatting scenarios after I went viral, everybody was doing something like across the board. There was people that were like releasing snakes into houses, taking squatters out at gunpoint, calling their lawyers and sitting in court for 2 years. There's like everything across the board. So I heard all the stories, and I just kind of consolidated all the info from that into my Squatter Defender course so that people could just sort of apply it to their scenario and make a wise decision on what to do. But to answer your question, most people just call their lawyer, and their lawyer says, okay, well, if the police aren't removing them, we have to evict them. And if we don't evict them, we can try ejectment also. So eviction is just getting rid of a tenant. You broke your contract, you're not paying, you gotta leave. Ejectment is you never had the right to be there in the first place, so we're just gonna get rid of you. And you'd think that would be quicker, but it's not. It's actually a long docket process. It often takes a whole lot longer. And eviction, kind of tacitly admitting like, oh yeah, this guy is a legitimate tenant, even though he's not, it takes a shorter amount of time. And remember, the objective is to get the guy out of your house. So you go the eviction route and you sit there with a straight face, telling a judge like, yes, this tenant needs to leave. And the guy doesn't show up, gets a continuance, hires a blood-sucking lawyer to defend him for free, usually from a state agency, and the process goes forever.
The thought that you have to go through the eviction process from somebody who never actually was a tenant is insane. And it's interesting, how many things like that do you think exist? Like, you saw Elon just recently in North Carolina talk about, he's trying to come on and deliver Starlink for people so that they could communicate, but part of the policy was that you can't land and give somebody something without their like verbal confirmation. And he's going, gang, if no one can communicate, this whole policy is void. This doesn't work. Kind of sounds like what you're just describing now. Is there a lot of that happening, do you think, nationwide? So let's start with that.
Boy, I'd like to think of some other examples, but I feel like we encounter them in situations pretty often in our lives where there is something that makes so much sense, common sense, like, okay, this guy shouldn't be here. He has no right to occupy this property. But there's a policy in place that's just sort of a catch-all for everything, and that's, landlord-tenant law. And unless you apply a specific law to a specific scenario, people are going to exploit it. And that's essentially like what's happened here. And then also on the deed fraud front, there's ways to fix that also, but it involves like a big government. It involves crafting new laws, and it involves a big overhaul. and government moves really, really slowly. You need to have a massive problem and a massive outcry for change to happen, if change is ever going to happen at all.
Okay, so do you think this is a function of the politicians that are creating the policies aren't real estate owners and don't know the dynamics of this? Or do you think it's more of like what you're saying with maybe some of the compassion, like kind of plan? Hey, tenants need help. This is unfortunate. We need protections. And then it creates an outcome that they weren't originally anticipating.
It's a little bit of both, but a lot of the latter. And that varies state to state. We'll just call it like the compassion for tenants. And I think you and I would both agree that there are some bad acting landlords out there that will just say, hey, you need to leave this house and you need to leave. And that's not a good thing. So that's why we have landlord-tenant law. But it's gone overboard in a lot of municipalities, to the point where non-paying tenants and squatters have a bundle of rights afforded to them to stick around that is beyond rationality. And it's well-intentioned. These laws are well-intentioned. They're to keep people from getting hauled out of their houses and out onto the street unnecessarily, but it enables and emboldens criminal acts. And that was what I heard about time and again from people. And it was just mind-boggling. It was happening in red states, blue states, and people tell me all the time, especially that are more right-leaning, say like, "Oh, this is just happening in blue states." And I'm like, actually, there's a lot of people like in Oklahoma and Texas that are telling me the same things, and they say like, "Oh, I would just grab my gun and pull them out at gunpoint." I'm like, "Yeah, actually, I heard about scenarios like that too, and they've resulted in people, the squatters." Unaliving them, and then the other way around, and then going to prison for it, and it can be messed up. So you got to consider all this when you're deciding what to do.
Yeah, that's right. So for I saw a video you did on homelessness.
Yeah.
I've been to Oregon many times. We've got a big homeless problem here as well.
Yeah.
You had a different approach than what I think the city had. My first question to you is what do you think the percentage of people struggling with homelessness is based on the affordability of housing versus mental illness and addiction?
People ascribe way too much of it to the price of housing, I think. I think it's a small percentage. But the people that are of sound mind, they want to work, they've got their act together, but they just can't afford the rent. These are the people that are out there seeking help, going to state agencies and actually getting help for themselves. They're not the problem. The problem are the drug-addicted homeless that are unwilling to seek help for themselves. And they're a strain on resources because we can't force them into rehab. And I think that 90-some% of the problem is addiction. If you talk to anybody who's in that space, they'll say that the large percentage of these people are addicts in one way or another, and mental illness and addiction, they go hand in hand. It exacerbates your mental illness, and if you've got a mental illness and no drug addiction, you're still in the same boat in that you can't be responsible in your mind for your actions, and it makes for a terrible situation because you really want to help these people, but they can't help themselves. So then you have the choice, like, do you force them? To me, the answer to that is yes, you absolutely do. Because sometimes people think that people won't change unless they want to. And that's often the case, that it makes it a whole lot easier to change because you can't change a light bulb unless the light bulb wants to change. But a lot of times, people can't even make that decision for themselves because they're so clouded by drug addiction and mental illness. And it's a reality that a lot of people haven't yet accepted, but I think they need to.
Yeah, so my little brother was homeless for over a decade. Mental illness, addiction. I think for him, he was the example that it was actually more mental illness and then saw addiction on top of it, where, it's very difficult to know which one created the other or if it is a combo.